The dust-covered boots of Jeremiah "Jed" McCready had walked the same weathered path into Millbrook, Texas, every Saturday morning for the past 3 years. The year was 1887, and the small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie had grown accustomed to the sight of the solitary cowboy leading his pack mule down Main Street. Yet familiarity had bred nothing but contempt among the townsfolk who watched him pass. Jed pulled his worn Stetson low over his eyes as he approached Henderson's general store, the morning sun casting long shadows across the dirt road that stretched between weathered wooden buildings. His weathered face, marked by years of relentless wind and scorching sun, bore the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find peace in solitude after the world had turned its back on him. At 42, he had spent the better part of 2 decades working cattle ranches across the vast expanses of Texas, moving from one spread to another as work demanded. But fate and circumstances had eventually led him to establish a small homestead 15 miles north of Millbrook, where he ran 30 head of cattle on land that nobody else wanted. The morning air was crisp with the promise of another scorching day, and the familiar sounds of a frontier town awakening filled the streets, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, the creaking of wagon wheels, and the distant lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. But beneath these ordinary sounds lay an undercurrent of tension that Jed had learned to recognize over his years of unwelcome visits to Millbrook. The town's reaction to his presence was as predictable as the sunrise, a ritual of rejection that had become as familiar to Jed as the morning routine of feeding his cattle. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of Millbrook's social standards, crossed to the opposite side of the street the moment she spotted him approaching, her elaborate silk dress rustling with indignation as she whispered urgently to her companion, Mrs. Sarah Whitmore, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the county and whose opinion carried considerable weight in the social circles of the town. "There goes that drifter again," Mrs. Pemberton hissed, her voice carrying on the morning breeze with the kind of venom reserved for those she considered beneath her station. "Mark my words, Sarah, men like that bring nothing but trouble to decent communities. No decent woman, no steady employment, no proper Christian upbringing that we can discern. The town council should have run him out long ago, before he could establish any kind of foothold in our area." Jed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin, but he continued his steady pace toward the store, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each measured step. He had heard similar words countless times over the past 3 years, delivered in variations by different voices, though the sting had never quite faded, like a wound that refused to heal properly. The truth was far more complex than these fine ladies in their imported dresses cared to understand, and certainly more complex than their narrow worldview could accommodate. The truth was more complex than these fine ladies cared to understand, and certainly more painful than Jed cared to share with a world that had already judged him unworthy. Jed had been married once to a gentlewoman named Mary Catherine, whom he had met at a church social in Oklahoma Territory. She had been the daughter of a schoolteacher, with soft brown hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and kindness. Mary had seen something in the young cowboy that others missed, a fundamental decency and strength of character that lay beneath his rough exterior. They had been married for 7 blissful years, during which Jed had built a successful ranch, accumulated a modest fortune, and dreamed of the children they would raise together on their land. But consumption had taken Mary slowly and painfully, despite the best efforts of doctors from as far away as Kansas City. Jed had spent everything he had on treatments and medicines, watching helplessly as the woman he loved wasted away before his eyes. After her death, a series of harsh winters and organized cattle rustlers had systematically destroyed what remained of his life's work, forcing him to sell everything he owned just to pay the debts that had accumulated during Mary's illness. The move to Texas had been his desperate attempt to start over, to find some small measure of peace in a world that seemed determined to break him completely. Inside Henderson's general store, the atmosphere grew noticeably colder as Jed removed his hat and approached the counter, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floors. The store smelled of leather, tobacco, and the various provisions that lined the shelves, pickled goods, sacks of flour and beans, and the assorted necessities of frontier life. Thomas Henderson, a portly man with thinning hair slicked back with pomade and calculating eyes that seemed to weigh every transaction for maximum profit, barely looked up from his leather-bound ledger where he meticulously recorded every penny that passed through his establishment. "What do you need, McCready?" Henderson's tone was brisk, businesslike, devoid of the warmth he showed his preferred customers, the ranchers and businessmen who formed the backbone of Millbrook's economy and social structure. "Need to settle my account and pick up some supplies," Jed replied quietly, his voice steady despite the obvious hostility in the room. He reached into his worn leather vest to retrieve a small roll of bills, carefully counted and recounted to ensure he had enough to cover his purchases. "Coffee, beans, salt, and ammunition if you have it." Henderson's expression soured further at the mention of ammunition, his small eyes narrowing with suspicion. The storekeeper had long harbored doubts about the solitary cowboy, influenced by the gossip and speculation that swirled through the town like dust devils across the prairie. "What kind of ammunition?" ".44 caliber for my rifle, 38 for my sidearm." The storekeeper's movements became deliberately slow as he gathered the requested items, making a show of his reluctance to complete the transaction. "You know, McCready, folks around here don't much care for the idea of a man stockpiling weapons. Makes them nervous, if you understand my meaning, especially a man with no visible means of support beyond a few mangy cattle." Jed met Henderson's gaze steadily, his blue eyes reflecting a patience born of years of enduring such treatment. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Henderson, but a man's got a right to protect his property and his livestock from predators. Had wolves take 3 calves last month, and there's been talk of rustlers working the area between here and Brownwood." "Wolves," Henderson repeated with obvious skepticism, loading the word with implications that went far beyond the 4-legged variety. "Is that what you call them these days?" The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, heavy with unspoken accusations. Jed had heard the rumors that circulated through Millbrook like a slow poison, whispered in parlors during afternoon tea, and discussed in hushed tones at church socials. Some folks believed he was an outlaw hiding from the law, using his isolated homestead as a base for criminal activities. Others suspected he was planning something sinister, stockpiling weapons for some nefarious purpose that their imaginations were all too willing to supply. The truth was far more mundane. Jeremiah McCready was simply a man trying to rebuild his life in a world that had little patience for second chances or the complexities of human suffering. As Jed counted out the exact payment for his purchases, laying each bill carefully on the counter, with the precision of a man who knew the value of every dollar, the store bell chimed with a cheerful sound that seemed oddly out of place in the tense atmosphere. Mayor William Ashford entered with his usual air of self-importance, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floor. Ashford was a small man who compensated for his physical limitations with an oversized personality and a voice that carried the authority of his office, earned through careful political maneuvering rather than any particular qualification for leadership. "Henderson," Ashford called out cheerfully, his mood clearly elevated by some recent success or anticipated triumph, then noticed Jed standing at the counter. His smile faltered slightly, like a candle flame disturbed by an unwelcome breeze. "Oh, McCready." "Mayor," Jed acknowledged with a polite nod, though he made no effort to extend the greeting beyond basic courtesy. Ashford approached the counter, positioning himself in a way that suggested he was addressing both men, but clearly favoring Henderson, who represented the kind of established business interests that formed the mayor's political base. "I trust you've heard about the territorial judges coming through next week. We're expecting quite a distinguished group, including Judge Morrison from Austin himself. The town council is planning a reception that will put Millbrook on the map." "That's wonderful news, Mayor," Henderson replied with genuine enthusiasm, seeing opportunity in the visit of important officials. "The whole town will want to make a good impression. This could mean new investment, maybe even a railroad spur." "Indeed," Ashford agreed, then glanced meaningfully at Jed, his intention clear to everyone present, which is why it's important that everyone in and around Millbrook understands the need for appropriate behavior during their visit. We can't have any incidents that might reflect poorly on our community. Jed finished packing his supplies into his saddlebags. "I'll be sure to stay out of everyone's way, Mayor." "That would be appreciated," Ashford replied. As Jed prepared to leave, young Timothy Walsh burst through the store's front door, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Timothy worked as a messenger for the telegraph office and was known throughout Millbrook for his breathless delivery of news. "Mayor Ashford," Timothy gasped, "you need to come quickly. There's been a telegram from Fort Worth. The Murphy gang broke out of jail 3 days ago, and they're heading this way." The color drained from Ashford's face. The Murphy gang was notorious throughout Texas for their brutality and their particular hatred of law enforcement and town officials. Led by Black Jack Murphy, the gang had terrorized settlements across the state for 2 years before finally being captured 6 months earlier. "How many men?" Ashford asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "6, sir, and they're riding hard. Sheriff Collins estimates they'll reach Millbrook by tomorrow evening." Henderson's hands trembled as he set down a jar of pickles. "Sheriff Collins is in Austin testifying at that trial. He won't be back for a week." "What about his deputy?" Ashford asked desperately. "Deputy Miller rode out to investigate cattle rustling near Brownwood. He's not expected back until Sunday." The reality of Millbrook's situation settled over the 3 men like a funeral shroud. The town had no law enforcement, no organized militia, and no means of defense against 6 hardened criminals. Jed quietly shouldered his supplies and moved toward the door, but Ashford's voice stopped him. "McCready, you fought in the war, didn't you?" Jed paused, his hand on the door handle. "I did." "Which side?" "Union Army, 3rd Texas Cavalry, served under Colonel Davis." This revelation surprised both Ashford and Henderson. Most men in the area had served with the Confederacy, and Jed's Union service explained much about his reception in Millbrook. "You must have seen combat," Ashford pressed. "I saw enough," Jed replied simply. "Then you understand what we're facing. The Murphy gang won't just rob us and leave. They'll burn the town and kill anyone who opposes them. We need experienced men." Jed turned slowly to face the mayor. "Are you asking for my help, Mayor?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ashford glanced at Henderson, who looked thoroughly uncomfortable. "I'm asking if you'd consider temporarily assisting with the town's defense." "The same town that spent 3 years making it clear I'm not welcome?" Ashford's face flushed red. "That's not... The situation is different now." "Is it?" Jed's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "This morning, Mrs. Pemberton crossed the street to avoid me. Henderson here treated me like a potential criminal for buying ammunition. You yourself suggested I should stay out of everyone's way. Now you want my help because you're scared." "McCready," Henderson interjected, "surely you wouldn't abandon innocent people in their time of need." Jed studied both men for a long moment. "No, Mr. Henderson, I wouldn't. But I also won't be treated like a hero today and a pariah tomorrow." With that, he walked out of the store, leaving the 2 men to contemplate their situation. As Jed loaded his supplies onto his pack mule, he could hear urgent conversations breaking out all along Main Street. Word of the Murphy gang's escape was spreading like wildfire, and panic was beginning to set in. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the few people in Millbrook who had always treated Jed with respect, approached him near the hitching post. Dr. Webb was a learned man who had come west after the war to start fresh. "Jed," Dr. Webb said quietly, "I know what Mayor Ashford asked you, and I understand your reluctance. But there are good people in this town, innocent people who don't deserve what's coming." Jed secured the last of his supplies before responding. "I know there are good people here, Doc. You've always been fair to me. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house has never been unkind. But for every decent person in Millbrook, there are 3 who'd rather see me gone." "Fear makes people say and do things they don't mean," Dr. Webb offered gently. "Maybe," Jed agreed, "but it also reveals their true nature. When the Murphy gang arrives, those same people will expect me to risk my life for them. When the danger passes, they'll go back to crossing the street to avoid me." Dr. Webb nodded slowly. "You're probably right, but the question isn't whether they deserve your help. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't give it." Jed mounted his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle. He sat in the saddle for a moment, looking down at the doctor. "I'll think about it, Doc, but I won't be anyone's convenient hero." The 15-mile ride to his homestead gave Jed time to think, the rhythm of Belle's hooves against the hard-packed earth providing a steady counterpoint to his churning thoughts. His small ranch was nestled in a valley between two hills, with a clear stream running through it and good grass for his cattle. The location was isolated but defensible, chosen as much for its solitude as for its practical advantages. He had built the cabin himself, along with a small barn and corral, using skills learned during his years of wandering and the determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. It wasn't much by the standards of the great ranches that dotted Texas, but it was his, purchased with the last of his money and built with his own hands. The late afternoon sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and under normal circumstances, Jed would have found peace in the familiar sight of his homestead coming into view. But as he approached his property, something felt wrong. His cattle, normally spread across the pasture in small groups, were bunched together in the far corner of his land, their heads raised and alert. This behavior usually indicated the presence of predators or strangers, and Jed's hand instinctively moved to the rifle scabbard attached to his saddle. The front door of his cabin stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered closing and latching it securely that morning before beginning his journey to town. The afternoon breeze moved the door gently on its hinges, creating a soft creaking sound that seemed ominous in the silence of the valley. Jed dismounted carefully, drawing his rifle and checking the surrounding area with the trained eye of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. Inside the cabin, he found clear signs of a hasty but thorough search. His few belongings had been rifled through with little regard for their value or his privacy. Books that had belonged to Mary lay scattered across the floor, their pages torn and dirty. His small cache of money, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, had been discovered and taken, not a fortune by any means, but enough to represent several months of careful saving. But more disturbing than the theft was the note left prominently on his kitchen table, written in a rough hand that spoke of violence and barely controlled rage. "Stay away from town, or you'll join them in hell. We know who you are and what you can do. Don't make us come back. J.M., Jack Murphy." The outlaw leader had somehow learned of Jed's presence in the area and his potential involvement in the town's defense. The message was clear. Jed had been marked for death if he interfered with the gang's plans for Millbrook. The fact that they had taken the time to search his home and leave a personal threat suggested they viewed him as a significant obstacle to their intended rampage. Jed sat down heavily at his kitchen table, the note still in his hand. The smart thing would be to pack up and leave immediately. He had no real ties to Millbrook, no compelling reason to risk his life for people who had treated him with disdain. But as he sat in the silence of his violated home, Jed found himself thinking about the people he would be abandoning. Timothy Walsh, barely 18 years old, Dr. Webb, who had dedicated his life to healing others. Mrs. Patterson, a widow who worked hard to maintain her boarding house. The schoolteacher, Miss Catherine Morrison, who had once smiled at him when he tipped his hat. As the sun began to set, Jed made his decision. He would not run. He would not allow fear to dictate his actions. If the Murphy gang wanted a fight, they would have one. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Jed rose before sunrise, fed his cattle, and prepared for what might be his last day. He rode into Millbrook around 8 o'clock, his rifle across his saddle and his sidearm clearly visible. The town was already in a state of barely controlled panic. Women and children were being evacuated to the church, while men gathered in small groups to discuss their hopeless situation. Mayor Ashford spotted Jed immediately and hurried over, his face a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "McCready, thank God you're here. We were afraid you'd... Well, we're grateful you came." "I'm not here for your gratitude, Mayor," Jed replied calmly. "I'm here because innocent people are in danger." About 20 men had gathered, ranging from teenagers to grandfathers, all carrying whatever weapons they could find. Most had never been in a real fight. "First, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with," Jed said. "Tell me everything about the Murphy gang." Henderson consulted a piece of paper. 6 men. Jack Murphy leads them. He's wanted for murder in 3 states. Then there's his brother Sam, Carlos Martinez, twin brothers Frank and Joe Harrison, and a man called Snake Thompson. "All experienced killers," Jed processed. "How many men do we have?" 22, counting yourself," Ashford replied. "How many have been in combat?" An older man stepped forward. "I served with Hood's Texas Brigade. Name's Pete Rawlings. A middle-aged man raised his hand. I was in the militia during the Indian Troubles. Robert Chen. I run the Chinese restaurant. That's 3 with combat experience, Jed said. Here's what we're going to do. The Murphy gang will arrive around sunset. They'll expect to find an easy target. We're going to give them a surprise. Jed began outlining his plan, drawing on his military experience. We'll use the buildings along Main Street as fortified positions. Henderson, close your store and position men on the roof. Chen, take 5 men to the hotel. You'll have a clear view from the 2nd floor. Pete, take another 5 behind the water trough at the north end of town. The men listened intently as Jed continued his briefing. His calm competence was already improving their morale. What about the women and children? Mrs. Pemberton asked, having apparently overcome her distaste for Jed. They stay in the church. It's the strongest building and set back from the main street. And if things go badly? Mayor Ashford asked. If things go well, we'll have 6 dead outlaws, and hopefully most of us will still be alive. But I won't lie, some of us probably won't see tomorrow. I won't order any man to stay, Jed continued. If you want to leave town with your families, now is the time. No one moved. The men of Millbrook were going to make their stand. The morning passed in preparation. Jed moved from position to position, checking fields of fire and trying to calm nerves. Around noon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. The Murphy gang was approaching ahead of schedule. Remember, Jed called out, don't shoot until I give the signal. Let them get well into the street before we open fire. Once it starts, don't stop shooting until it's over. The 6 riders approached Millbrook with casual confidence. Jack Murphy rode at the head, a tall man with a black beard and cold eyes. His brother Sam was shorter but stockier. The others spread out slightly as they entered the town. Looks quiet, Sam Murphy observed. Too quiet, Jack replied. But that's how we like it. They rode slowly down Main Street, scanning the buildings. The town appeared completely deserted. This is Jack Murphy, the outlaw leader called out. We know you're here somewhere. Come out and maybe we'll make this quick. Silence. I said come out. Murphy's voice rose angrily. We're going to take what we want anyway. That was when Jed stepped out from behind the water trough, his rifle held ready. He walked slowly toward the center of the street, stopping about 30 yards from the gang. I'm here, he said simply. Jack Murphy's eyes widened with recognition. Well, Jeremiah McCready. Should have known you'd turn up where there's trouble. You know me? Know of you, Murphy replied. Heard you were hiding out in this worthless town. These people are under my protection, Jed said calmly. Murphy laughed harshly. Your protection, 1 man against 6? Why don't you and your boys ride on out of here? Can't do that. See, we need supplies and we need money. This town's going to provide both. No, Jed said simply. It's not. You're outnumbered 6 to 1, Murphy pointed out. Am I? Jed asked quietly. That was the signal. The men of Millbrook rose from their positions, their weapons trained on the Murphy gang from 3 different directions. The outlaws suddenly found themselves in a crossfire with no escape route. Son of a bitch, Sam Murphy muttered. Easy, Sam, Jack warned. Let's think about this. Nothing to think about, Jed replied. You're surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender. Murphy's laugh was bitter. You know that's not going to happen, McCready. Then you're going to die, Jed said matter-of-factly. Last chance, Jed offered. Ride out now and nobody has to die today. Murphy's response was to draw his gun with lightning speed, but Jed was ready. His rifle came up smoothly, and he fired before Murphy could bring his weapon to bear. The shot took Murphy in the chest, spinning him from his saddle. The rest of the gang reacted instantly, and the air suddenly filled with the roar of gunfire. Sam Murphy got off 2 shots before Pete Rawlings brought him down. Carlos Martinez made it to cover, but was caught in crossfire from Chen's position. The Harrison twins tried to run, but were cut down before they could reach the end of the street. Snake Thompson proved most dangerous, rolling behind a water barrel and returning fire with deadly accuracy. His shots wounded 3 defenders before Jed finally got close enough for a clean shot. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sounds were groans of the wounded and nervous whinnying of horses. Jed moved carefully from body to body, checking to make sure all the outlaws were dead. Is it over? Mayor Ashford called out. It's over, Jed confirmed. The men of Millbrook emerged from their positions, their faces showing relief and disbelief. They had done it. They had defeated the Murphy gang. Dr. Webb rushed to tend the wounded. Considering what they had faced, casualties were remarkably light. "McCready!" Henderson called out, his voice shaking. "We did it!" Jed nodded, but felt no joy in the victory. 6 men lay dead in the street, and while they had been killers, they had also been human beings. As the immediate aftermath was dealt with, Jed found himself the center of attention. The same people who had shunned him were now clustering around him, eager to shake his hand and express gratitude. "McCready, Mrs. Pemberton said, approaching with tears in her eyes. "I owe you an apology, we all do. You risked your life for us, and we treated you shamefully." "Mrs. Pemberton, fear makes people act in ways they wouldn't normally. I don't hold grudges." "But you should," she insisted. "What we did was wrong. You're a good man, and we were too blind to see it." Dr. Webb approached as the crowd began to thin. "What will you do now, Jed?" "I'll head back to my place. Got cattle to tend to. You know you're welcome to stay in town now. After what you've done, no one would question your right to be here." Mayor Ashford intercepted him as he prepared to leave. "McCready, wait. The town council wants to offer you the position of sheriff. Permanent position, good salary, respect from the community." Jed paused. "That's generous, Mayor, but I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job." "You're exactly the right man," Ashford insisted. "You proved that today. Today was different. Today everyone had the same enemy. Tomorrow you'll remember that I'm still the same man you didn't want in your town 3 days ago." "That's not true," Ashford protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Jed mounted his horse. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll decline." "Then what can we do? How can we make this right?" Jed considered the question. "Just treat people fairly, Mayor. Don't judge a man by his past or his circumstances. Judge him by his actions." With that, he turned his horse toward home. As he rode through the gathering dusk, he could hear sounds of celebration beginning, a town rejoicing in its salvation. But 3 days later, Jed returned to find the townspeople still grateful, still changed by what they had experienced together. Dr. Webb met him at the edge of town. "They mean it this time, Jed," the doctor said. "The gratitude, the respect, it's real. People have been asking about you, wanting to make sure you're all right." Over the following weeks, Jed found himself drawn back to Millbrook more and more frequently. The change in the townspeople's attitude was genuine and lasting. Mrs. Pemberton invited him to dinner. Henderson treated him like family. Even the children looked up to him. Most significantly, Miss Catherine Morrison, the schoolteacher, began engaging him in conversation about books and current events. She was an educated woman from back east who saw in Jed the same qualities Dr. Webb had recognized: fundamental decency shaped by hardship but not broken by it. When the town council approached him again about the sheriff's position, this time Jed accepted. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with the entire town in attendance. His first act was to appoint Robert Chen as his deputy, a gesture that symbolized the new spirit of acceptance in Millbrook. Over the following year, Jed settled into his role with quiet competence. The town flourished under his protection, becoming known throughout the region as a place where law was respected and criminals were not welcome. His courtship with Catherine developed slowly and naturally. She encouraged his reading, shared her books with him, and helped him see that his past failures didn't define his future possibilities. Their wedding took place exactly 1 year after the Murphy gang incident, in the same church that had once served as refuge. The entire town celebrated, with Mayor Ashford presenting them with a house on Elm Street as the community's wedding gift. 2 years later, Sheriff Jeremiah McCready stood on his front porch, watching his young son play in the yard while Catherine tended to their infant daughter. The transformation was complete. The despised drifter had become the beloved sheriff. The rejected outsider had become the cornerstone of the community. The story became part of Millbrook's folklore, told and retold as an example of how people could change and find redemption in the most unlikely circumstances. In quiet moments, Jed sometimes thought about that dusty morning when he had faced 6 killers in the street. He had thought he was fighting for a town that didn't want him, but he had actually been fighting for something much more important: the chance to prove that every man deserves the opportunity to show his true character. The lonely cowboy had found his way home at last.